why sufficiently decentralized instead of completely centralized or completely decentralized?
Yeah, so maybe just start with the issues of a centralized network or a completely decentralized network. So if we start with the centralized network problems, I mean, I'm sure your audience will know that there have been a bunch of problems with centralized social media companies over the last few years. You may have varying opinions on them. There's a lot of political spin on either side of that. But I think you could get a universal consensus that they're not perfect. And so there's room for improvement. And I think the challenge with centralized social networks is...
Hello, everyone. Today, I'm here with Dan Romero. He's really into crypto. He was the VP of product at Coinbase, and now he's the co-founder of Farcaster, a sufficiently decentralized social network. I want to start a little bit with overview of what's Farcaster and what it means to be a sufficiently decentralized social network.
So first of all, thanks for having me. The way I describe Farcaster is it's a new type of social network, and it's a social network where you as a user control your identity and can bring that identity between any application that you want to use. And that actually helps define the term that we use, sufficient decentralization, where I think a lot of people, when they think about centralization versus decentralization, you kind of have your classic Web 2 companies, Facebook, Twitter on the Web 2 side as the centralized options. And then you have the kind of extreme decentralized options, something like secure scuttlebutt. Mastodon being actually something that's probably in between. And so may actually meet some threshold of sufficiently decentralized. But our point of view is actually, when you want to build something that is more decentralized, not to start with the most extreme decentralized architecture. It's actually start with the centralized architecture, because the revealed preference of consumers is they like using those apps. So they have hundreds of millions, if not billions of users. And so you want to start with the user experience of a centralized application and then work to remove parts of the app that are centralized and kind of prevent, the ability to exit the app with interoperability or the ability to switch to whatever client that you want, and change the parts of the underlying architecture to be more decentralized on those parts. And so in the case of Farcaster, the app that you may use today looks a lot like Twitter. And in a lot of ways, a lot of the same infrastructure. We're running a lot of the like kind of feed generation infrastructure, the notification infrastructure on centralized servers, just like Twitter would be. But the core identity primitive is something that lives on the Ethereum blockchain and lives outside of the infrastructure that our company has. So that means if for whatever reason you didn't want to use our app anymore, you would be able to go use an app from another developer and everything would work completely as normal. Contrast that to something like Twitter or YouTube today. So you're on Twitter, you have 1 million followers, Twitter decides to remove your account. You don't get a chance to export your followers. There is no recourse. You can't go to court to say, I need to be reinstated. Twitter's a private company. They can do whatever they want. Same thing with YouTube. And contrast that in Web 2 also to something like Substack, where I can build an audience with Substack. I, as the kind of creator or the publisher, own my email list. And so in the case that Substack, for whatever reason, didn't want to work with me, and they're generally actually pretty permissive of a wide variety of viewpoints, so I'm not picking on Substack, but pointing out that whether it's Substack or myself as the publisher want to move, I can move to a different email newsletter provider, whether that's the centralized one, or I can run my own server. And the important thing is my audience doesn't know any different, right? Like they can still receive an email the next week and it all works, because email is built on top of decentralized protocols like DNS and email. And so to bring it all back to the beginning, what we're trying to do with Farcaster is we're trying to build something that's similar to email or DNS, but specifically for social, in that it's a low-level primitive that any developer can actually go build on top of, and then you as the user have the freedom to move between any application that you see fit.
Awesome. So let's go into a little bit more detail what it means to be decentralized. So you mentioned that the identity is decentralized. What does it mean for identity to be decentralized? Is the social graph graph as well sitting on the Ethereum blockchain, or what is sitting on the blockchain? Is it the FID, or can you go into a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so the core thing that with a network like Twitter, so kind of a public broadcast network where the ability to follow another user or subscribe to another user on the network is not permissioned, right? So on a network like Facebook or LinkedIn, if I want to connect with you, that's a bi-directional relationship. I make a friend request or a LinkedIn request, and then the other party needs to accept that. Twitter, for all intents and purposes, the default type of Twitter account is public. Everything is public about it. So all of the posts are public, all of the likes are public, who follows whom is public. I can follow you, you don't have to follow me back, and that's just how the network works, right? So in that case, the thing that is actually most critical to decentralization, so the easiest way to actually think about this is from a first principle standpoint, is just think about what happens if you have that million followers on Twitter and you get kicked off of Twitter. If you were to force rank all the things that you care about, your old tweets, your direct messages, your likes, none of those things actually matter relative to the fact that what you had achieved prior to being kicked off of something like Twitter was you had 1 million people, all distributed around, who had indicated in a piece of software that anytime I post to this network, please show me that content, right? So if you think about that can be boiled down to as a simple, there is a pointer somewhere that says content from X person lives here. And then whatever software they're using can actually go and try to retrieve that. And so if you're a little bit older school on the side of things, like RSS is basically that, right? So I have a blog, I can have an RSS feed, I let someone subscribe to that, and then when they open up their RSS reader, the way that architecture works is the RSS reader would go, okay, danromero.org/RSS, I'm going to go check to see if there are any new posts. And in doing so, what you've effectively said is the critical thing is to have an ever-present pointer for me as a publisher that I can have that people know where to find. So there's some version of an identity, and then it kind of points to where the content exists. And so that's essentially what we've focused on for decentralization with Farcaster, because then that means no matter what application you're using, as long as it's properly authenticated, as you can prove that it is actually coming from me or from you, then the content can actually go out to the Farcaster protocol, and then any application can pull it in and then verify that it actually did indeed come from the person that says, who they said that we're coming from. So I think the way to think about that is if you just focus on the thing that needs the most effort on decentralization, then the rest of the experiences can actually be more centralized if that's actually what's going to offer users a better user experience. And so as a result of that, where we've put the most effort is this kind of identity primitive. There's a middle layer where the content actually lives, and that's something we call Farcaster hubs, which we're actually still kind of in the process of building out, where you can kind of think of it as a blockchain without a cryptocurrency, and in some ways, like, you don't need the kind of security guarantees of it, because what you've actually done is you've put the canonical identity for this network on chain, right? Dan is this Ethereum address. And as a result of that Ethereum address being a public key, any piece of content that ends up on the kind of like Farcaster content network, the hubs, can be signed with the private key that maps to the public key that's on chain. And then any user has a very easy chain of trust of, okay, this is claiming to be from Dan. I'm going to check the signature. Does the signature match the pub key that is on the Ethereum blockchain? Yes. Okay, great. Then the content works. Obviously, no one is individually doing that. But the system is architected in a way that this can all automatically happen behind the scenes. And for the end user, all they see is they have high trust that the content that they see in their app is coming from the person that it claims to be. There is a single universal name, right? So there are compared to something that's like more federated, where it's actually based on domains, and Dan on Farcaster.social versus Dan on Farcaster.me, like that's actually two different people. In the Farcaster system, it's similar to Twitter or Instagram, is there's a universal namespace. So, Dan, I'm actually DWR. DWR on Farcaster, there can only be one. and like you have a reasonable guarantee that if the app that you're using is following the Farcaster protocol, you don't have to be confused. And so any app that you switch to, assuming it's not malicious, it becomes very easy to identify that the same person is who they say they are. And so that's the kind of like melding of like, we're trying to kind of create this decentralized identity space, which still needs to kind of be sorted out, and we'll see if it ends up working at scale, with the user experience of Web 2, which we know works at scale and that users like. And so that's the bet with Farcaster. It's like, can you blend the best of both worlds?
That's awesome. That's really cool. One question that I have is related to the social graph, right? Like the social graph, there is still a social graph that you build on top of the client. Is that still sitting on the blockchain, or is that separate? Each application will have a social graph, and we can go later on into AMPs, which I think are a little bit, separate from the social graph, but will be used in applications on top.
Yeah, so our original hope was to put the traditional follow graph, who, I follow you, you follow me, that those are all just kind of pieces of data that you could then construct in a decentralized way. Put that on the Farcaster hubs, right? So it's kind of like this permissionless data set. Any developer can spin up a hub and then have access to the global state of the network. I think where it gets a little challenging is, so if you actually think of what a Twitter follow is, it actually means two different things. So the first thing, which is actually what most people initially think, is I want to follow this content. I like show me more of this content, or show me every time that this user posts. But in a network where it's actually public, like Twitter, and people can actually go through and see who you're following, and if you're not following that many people, there's actually this secondary thing that's it's an implicit endorsement, right? So if I follow X person and I'm only following 200 people, clearly that person is at a minimum interesting, and at like kind of beyond that is like something that I endorse what they're saying. And obviously that's not the actual case. Like you could follow plenty of people you disagree with, and in some ways that should be encouraged. But I think that the revealed preference is that people, I don't know, they have mixed feelings on who they follow, or it actually probably there's a number of follows that would happen on people's main account if they could make those private, right? And so what do you get? You get all these people use lists, which are private. People have alt Twitter accounts where they follow people. And so our view is, that action is a bundled action. That could you actually separate what the I want to see more information from this person, I want to endorse this person. And then the second thing is, in a decentralized network, you have no guarantee that different applications are going to respect the decentralized follow, right? Because if there's user demand for private follows, you're going to have some applications that just do private follows. And then so at best, you're getting an altruistic social graph versus, I think one thing that we strongly believe as we're building these systems out is incentives rule everything. And so what you want to do is actually design things that end up at the protocol that have an incentive to actually naturally be decentralized. And so a cast, like a public post, has a natural incentive to be decentralized because most people who are casting, they're optimizing for distribution, right? They want as many people to see the post as possible, or the people that they want to see it. So as a result, you using an application that does not actually publish a cast to the protocol means if your other followers are not using the same client as you, you're not going to see that. So there's a game theory in that you're only going to get users to use your client unless you're actually using the protocol. So cast is a natural area or a natural content type that will be decentralized just by virtue of the incentives. Likes the same thing, right? A private like, that's a bookmark, but I think a public like is actually meant to give some amount of interaction with the person who posted a post. So most apps are probably going to follow the public like, and then to the degree that you want to do a private like, just call it a bookmark. The last thing though, with if you think about follows, is then, well, if you want to split what follow the content and endorse, we came up with this concept called AMPs, which you can think of an AMP as a kind of recast, and for those who aren't in Farcaster, a recast is the equivalent of a retweet. And if you think about today on something like Twitter, you only can retweet a tweet. You cannot retweet an account. And so for us, AMPs are this concept of It's something you have a limited quantity of, so there's some scarcity to it. They automatically expire, which actually creates a level of freshness for them. And as a result of the mechanic, you're not actually taking a piece of content that your AMP stands for amplify. You are amplifying the account. And so what we're hoping is you actually start to get a dynamic leaderboard for the network of interestingness, right? Like an AMP can mean anything, but for the most part, like when you recast something or you retweet something, you're basically saying kind of like, I want to boost this. So again, some amount of implicit endorsement. And so I think AMPs will be that for accounts. And then the nice thing is because they automatically expire, it's not a cumulative metric, right? It's actually something that you have to have some skin in the game, proof of work, where people are constantly wanting to boost your account because you're contributing interesting takes or liquidity to the social network. And so the long answer to all this is the superior version in a decentralized system of a social graph, where you can't guarantee every client's going to follow it, is use the primitives that you know have an incentive to be decentralized and effectively create an implicit social graph where you actually look at who you are replying to, who are you are liking, and who you are amping. And so by actually taking that, you in some ways actually get something closer to maybe the original PageRank model for Google, which if you think about how pages were ranked, it was, okay, some amount of semantic analysis of what's on the page, but then who was linking to you, and then the recursive algorithm of who was linking to those websites and giving everyone a score. And then as a result of the score, you score the actual content based on the interestingness, based on how interesting the people linking to you are. And I think that's probably the world that we're headed into with decentralized social. I could be wrong, but I think if you strongly believe incentives are the only way to guarantee that people will kind of follow through on things, then I think an implicit social graph is probably more likely. And in some ways actually more effective, right? Because if I follow you and I never interact with your content versus I follow you and I reply to every one of your casts and I like every one of your tweets, that's technically we're each being followed once, but there's way more engagement on one than the other.
Very cool. So let me play the devil's advocate, right? Why make it a sufficiently decentralized social network? The centralized ones work great. Twitter is perfect. It has no problems whatsoever, right? Like these social networks have no problems whatsoever. Why make it sufficient decentralized? And another question related to that, why not make completely decentralized, right? So why sufficiently decentralized instead of completely centralized or completely decentralized?
Yeah, so maybe just start with the issues of a centralized network or a completely decentralized network. So if we start with the centralized network problems, I mean, I'm sure your audience will know that there have been a bunch of problems with centralized social media companies over the last few years. You may have varying opinions on them. There's a lot of political spin on either side of that. But I think you could get a universal consensus that they're not perfect. And so there's room for improvement. And I think the challenge with centralized social networks is they don't allow client choice because of the way that their business models are. And you could actually build a centralized social network potentially with a different business model that may have this to work, but we can put that to the side. So yeah, maybe you could go try to build a competitor to Twitter that's completely centralized. But I think that the challenge is, if you don't have client choice, then inevitably you're bundling a whole bunch of things together. So you're bundling content hosting, which there's liability with content hosting, which then means content moderation gets bundled in. And it's not like they offer you different versions of content moderation. There's kind of like a single content moderation omnibus policy per social network. And then you actually don't own your distribution, right? And so that if you view these, especially public broadcast networks, as this kind of tool to reach an audience, and if your business is being in the business of producing content, not having control of your audience seems kind of crazy. But and especially because we have contrasting examples of both the web and email, and so it's just the fact that these kind of networks have so much attention share forces all of these people to have to use them, but they're still at the whim of these networks. And so you can be yanked from the network at any point for whatever reason. And it used to be, oh, the only people who were getting banned from networks were right-wing people. But I think we've just gone through a period recently with Twitter where a bunch of left-leaning people were kicked off the networks. And the same people who a year ago were saying, oh, build your own Twitter, or, this is the right model for content moderation, have become staunch defenders of free speech and thinking that policies saying that you can't link to Mastodon or whatever are completely ridiculous, which they are. And so getting a network like Twitter to be a credibly neutral common ground like email or the web, I think is a moral imperative. And then I think to go over to the reason, well, why don't you just make it completely decentralized? And so there's no centralized point of failure. Well, so first of all, our belief is if you actually make the identity decentralized, and then you still have centralized operators of kind of services, then that's the kind of like happy medium. So it's not like it's centralized relative to a decentralized thing, but in like a purely decentralized system, something that's completely peer-to-peer, the usability isn't there. So it's ideologues. It's the year of desktop Linux. It's like, oh well, if everyone just got a little smarter and more sophisticated, then we could have a utopia. But the reveal preferences consumers don't care. They care about usability and convenience. And so you have to marry the two. You have to have the core parts of the architecture be in a way that are sovereign, censorship resistant, whatever term you want, right? I like to use consumer choice. Like I have pure freedom to move between different applications on the email network, as well as on a network like Farcaster. Same thing with a web host, right? And then you have to have the usability and performance and convenience that people expect. Otherwise, you're never going to get the audience to show up. Thus, even if you're publishing on this decentralized thing, you're just like, who cares if there are not that many people using it? And so the goal here is an internet scale protocol that billions of people are using. And so if we want to get to that internet scale, you have to have the users, and the users are only going to come if the user experience is good. But to your point, it's like, okay, so do you go build a centralized company, right? And just like a more developer-centric version of Twitter. And I would argue that because of examples like Twitter pulling the rug out from under their developer platform, Facebook pulling the rug out from their developer platform, some of the stuff that's happened with the app stores on mobile, is I think developers are deeply skeptical of building on other people's platforms. Basically, the only company that's actually, like, I think, maintained a really, really good standing with developers for a long time, and I'm sure I'm ignorant to some of the history where they maybe less good, is Microsoft, right? It's like they I think realize, and there's the famous quote, I think it was like Chamath was talking about Facebook being a platform, and Bill Gates was in the room, and Bill Gates was like, that's not a platform. Platform is when the aggregate value of all of the companies built on top of your thing is greater than the thing. And in the case of Microsoft, that's a pretty big thing. And so I think my push is people are sophisticated enough to know, why would I go build a business that now has platform risk? Because if you want to extract more rent from me, you're going to be able to do it. And I think the mobile app stores are a great example of this. Is yes, there are actually a lot of big companies that have been built on top of it, but over the last 5 years, those policies have been more and more extractive as a result of this kind of like duopoly that exists within the mobile ecosystem. And so all the way back is, I think that the only interesting way to get serious developers to build really at scale, interesting new companies and projects is to actually prove to them that they can't have the rug pulled out from under them. Thus, you need to make it decentralized enough that the developer trusts the network exists, right? And going all the way back to how to define it, another way I define Farcaster is it guarantees two things. If I publish something and I have an audience, then the protocol itself should have no intermediator. There's no intermediary between myself and my audience. Like that, it just works, right? We can have different service providers, but the protocol itself will distribute the message. On the developer side, the developer should have permissionless access to the data and APIs for forever, right? Like, and that's one of the reasons we're working on this thing called Farcaster Hubs, is when those launch, hopefully in May, the network will, for the first time, from a data and API access standpoint, onboarding will still be gated, But from a data and API access standpoint, once you're into Farcaster, you can do whatever you want with the network in the same way that you could with something like Ethereum. And so that's the focus of building a sufficiently decentralized network. It's trying to get the usability of Web 2 with the ownership, strong access guarantees of Web 3.
Interesting. When you're talking about the protocol, I was just thinking about SMTP, and I was thinking that I don't even know who created or which company was involved, into building that. And it's something that there's so many tools built on top of it. And I imagine that for Farcaster, who hopefully hit a point where we don't even know that Markle Manufactory, which you guys started, create Farcaster. It becomes such a used protocol that that would be nice. In 100 years from now or 200 years from now, we look back and be like, that it was like actually Dan Romero and Varun that created this protocol that everyone uses. Related to the protocol and the network. So you both are building a product-led protocol. So if I'm mistaken, you can correct me there, but it seems that you're building some sort of Twitter-like experience on top of this protocol, and you are really focusing on making sure that the growth is very deliberate instead of letting users just flood the system. Why is that? Is there a benefit, and what are the pros and cons of that approach?
I'll take it in two parts. So the first, product-led protocol, goes back to this idea that you have to make it easy, usable, convenient for end users to use something, right? Like if it requires them installing some command line tool or compiling, like never going to happen, right? And so you have to make easy to use apps in order to actually bootstrap, because you're building a social network, right? And so the atomic unit here is a post or a like, and getting the social liquidity requires people to actually have ways of doing that, right? Like if the first step is, well, we have this protocol, build a client, and then if you have a client, then convince other people to show up, and then we'll have an interesting protocol. Whereas I think we flipped it on its head as saying, if you want to get to an internet scale protocol, you need a bunch of apps and services. Apps and services are only going to show up if there are users, right? Like just assume everyone is lazy, not in a bad way, just like you have to do the work. And so in order to actually attract developers, you need a population of daily active users, because that's actually the hard thing. That's the thing that developers like really want, right? Like building the technical stuff is fun, but that's like achievable. Getting users is actually the hard thing, like more than anything else. In most cases, right? There are examples of technology companies where the tech is the hard part, but generally with software, it's getting users, right? Distribution. And so our point of view is the thing that will be most attractive to building on top of Farcaster is if we have bootstrapped an initial user base of highly engaged daily active users, right? And an analogy here is the iPhone App Store, right? Which is an extremely successful developer platform. The first year the iPhone existed, there was no App Store. You couldn't build a native app. Apple built all the native apps for the iPhone. And only after that first year, after they sold 5-10 million iPhones, did they launch the App Store. And then they had an immediate marketing point where they could say, hey, we have 5 or 10 million people walking around that you're a daily active user if you have a phone because it's on your body. And so it naturally became a place where developers wanted to start tinkering. And even then, it took multiple years to finally get to a place where you had the native apps that kind of discovered the magic of what makes a mobile app like Instagram or WhatsApp. And so it takes time to kind of build those ecosystems. And so from our standpoint is, okay, well, if we want to get to this long-term goal, the best way to start out is build the initial version of the protocol. No, it's not necessarily going to scale. And then spend most of your time building the initial app. And we quickly realized that most of the features that are table stakes to building a new social app, regardless of if there's some new mechanic, most of them look like Twitter, right? It's like the ability to post, the ability to reply, the ability to get notifications, ability to like, to follow. And so I think if you just think of it like, what is an MVP social network? For the most part, it's something that looks like Twitter. And yeah, the mechanics can be slightly different or very similar, but that's like the foundation, right? Because if you just basically make a client that, if you just think of Twitter as like kind of like a very simple generic structure, if you make a Twitter client that is primarily focused on images as the post, you have Instagram, right? If you make a client that is every post has to be a video, and instead of stacking them up, you autoplay them and you only show one at a time, you have TikTok. And so if you just think of these public social networks as kind of a little bit of remixes and then UI changes on how they exist, then you can actually get to a place where Farcaster, the protocol, does the heavy lifting on identity, authenticating messages, propagating messages, storing messages, and then handling, how someone is replying to another person or the interactions that are happening between them. But other than that, developers can actually build whatever experience they want on top of it. And it's just actually displaying the same data in a very different way, right? Just imagine taking TikTok. If all of the social networks are built on an open standard, TikTok or Instagram could be totally displayed in a Twitter-like feed, like in Twitter, right? It would say the person's name, assuming you had the same username across all of them. Geo just published a video on TikTok, and then you have a link to the TikTok, or even embedded in there, and then you click it. That's how Twitter does it versus the way TikTok autoplays. And so I think that is the strategy on the product-led protocol is bootstrap enough that now there's enough people using it that other people are going to be interested in building other apps. The second part on the onboarding side of things, we have a strong belief that quality is hard to maintain regardless. And the best time to have quality is at the beginning because you have the most control, right? And if you actually have your quality dip too low, too fast, it's going to be very hard to attract, right? If you have a low quality social network in terms of like you just invited as many people to juice your numbers, the high quality people don't really want to be there. And if you don't have those high quality people, like those are the people that actually bring in audiences. And so our strategy was, well, why don't we just take this a little bit more gradual? We have a ton of stuff that we need to build and just try to be consistent, grow 5% every week, send out X number of invites, measure that, see how the retention is, talk to users, figure out like what's working, what's not. And there's a secondary component of that with consumer apps. People actually make an initial judgment the first time they use an app, and it's very hard to unwind that judgment, right? So if I show up to an app in the early days because I wanted to go for viral growth, and outside of something being so compelling, right, like it is so different and new and not easily copyable, by the way, by another existing network, I might stick around even despite issues. So like BeReal is an interesting example of this. Like BeReal is a new primitive, like very simple kind of game type social network. Can be copied by the other networks. I think that they're trying to play around with it. They've had issues where you try to load because everyone loads the BeReal at the same time per day and their servers don't work. But clearly they've tapped into something that's so powerful that they're continuing to grow and retain users. So outside of coming up with some new primitive that is so good, I think that the better like kind of like iterative approach, if you don't have that lightning in a bottle new feature, is keep your onboarding more limited and then iteratively improve it. And then you're naturally going to find a group of users that even the rough app resonates with. And the incremental improvements that happen every week or every month is enough to keep them around. And I think is you can build up cohorts of those people. At a certain point, you actually start to hit a sufficient conversational liquidity that the people who originally would have churned because it wasn't interesting enough now are sticking around because it's going from kind of this bar that has like 3 people in it to it's like a really lively bar. So even if you don't know everyone here, it's like actually kind of fun to be there. And so that's the mentality that we have. All that said, we have 8,000 people in a beta. Like if you just think of orders of magnitude, that probably works for another maybe 10,000 people or 20,000 people. But to get to that next order of magnitude, 100,000, I think we need to change our tactics and think through. It's like, okay, how do you solve for that next order of magnitude? And then 100,000 to 1 million is going to be a different challenge.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, Farcaster has the best community out there for tech-centric people. It seems that Farcaster is the new South Park, where, like all the builders in 10 years ago would, gather around South Park, Twitter. Apparently, the idea came out in South Park. It seems that, all the cool crypto people are in Farcaster, and we see a lot of applications built on top of Farcaster and also other crypto applications that people use Farcaster to distribute. And it's a great platform to distribute. So I love that. You've mentioned in another interview that, there's an analogy of using if addresses and edu addresses, with Facebook and whatnot. Are you approaching onboarding users that have if addresses? Is that right? And if so, why?
Yeah, so I think it's worth identifying the initial niche that you hope to kind of like build some amount of community and traction with. And for us, it was naturally Varun and I had both been at Coinbase for a while. Like we were kind of at home within the crypto world. And I think for me personally, like I joined Coinbase, we were like Bitcoin only, and I still own Bitcoin and I think highly of Bitcoin. But I think over my time at Coinbase, the natural community that I shifted towards was more oriented towards Ethereum, because I tend to be more pragmatic and I'm much more interested in forward progress. And I think where my biggest critique with Bitcoin is I think it's okay to be conservative. I really respect the like kind of intellectual foundation of like what they're trying to achieve. But I think what's challenging is going back to my point about centralization versus decentralization. You might actually have the high ground on ideals. And in the case of Bitcoin, obviously there's, I think, the brand advantage and just market cap and being first mover. But I think it's very dangerous from a, like, the world is there are competing things all over the, all the time, right? And so whether you like it or not, Bitcoin and Ethereum are competing for certain things. And I think what I like about Ethereum, there are plenty of things I don't necessarily like about Ethereum, but the thing I like about Ethereum is there's a sense of forward progress and an improvement towards like making this computing platform that you can go build anything on top of it. I can't build the Farcaster identity registry on top of Bitcoin. And then you have a whole bunch of people to kind of like say, oh, we'll build it on an L2. It's like, no, I don't want to build it on an L2. I want the security guarantees of an L1. And so you can go back and forth on whether Bitcoin versus Ethereum, but the reality is, even if you said Bitcoin is more secure, Ethereum is the clear number two. And so in that case, like I would take Ethereum over any L2 experimental system, just from a Lindy has survived some actually pretty big things in its history. And so, look, I hope to get to a point where Farcaster is actually just like anyone interested in anything wants to use it. But if I had to pick a community to go after, the one I best understood within the crypto world is Ethereum, right? I don't actually know really much about Solana, like any Cosmos, other things like that. And so it's like focus on Ethereum. That's my social network was there. And the other thing I think that's important is we actually just don't do that much on chain. And so, like, if you think about the existing Farcaster client experience, yes, we show NFTs in the app, but it's not necessary. Like you could go build a client that didn't have any of that. And in some ways, you can actually abstract away the stuff that's happening on chain in a way that you just do that one action on chain when you initially register, and then you could have a completely different experience the rest of the time. So it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with Ethereum. And so I think that my general philosophy is build something that people are actually going to use. That's the most important thing. And then from there, you kind of earn the right to expand out over time.
Very interesting. Yeah. I sit in a very weird place myself because I like all these different communities and I find myself without a tribe. I think Bitcoin has a lot of value because it's very conservative, and if you're dealing with money, I think that's very, very important. I think a lot of people care about that. At the same time, I really like Ethereum because there's so many applications being built on top of it. I mean, Uniswap is a clear example, right? But there are some also newer protocols, like Solana and Avalanche and Aptos and so on. We'll see which ones turn out to be actually, sustainable and good and have a clear user base and developer base. Ethereum seems to actually, have a strong user base, but we'll see. It's hard to say in 5 years, 10 years, at least in my opinion. One question that I have though is, for Ethereum, what are the things that you think Ethereum is doing really well and things that the Ethereum can actually improve? And yeah, we can start there.
Yeah. So look, for better, for worse, gas costs, it's just not good for growth, right? And when you understand what gas costs are, is okay, we have this limited amount of resource, we're now having a free market for it. In some ways, it's quite elegant and great. But if you're in I'm trying to build an application that's going to scale to millions, if not billions of people, that just like directly interacting with Ethereum is just not going to happen, because I think the revealed preference of consumers is they like free, right? And so I think driving down gas costs through whatever set of techniques, whether that's kind of optimizations of how the network works, or using L2s and then figuring out what applications should live in L2s, assuming you can actually get good security guarantees. I know that's the priority, but like I think it's very clear that like it's a blocker to growth is as a result of like having high gas costs. And so maybe there could have been an argument, and I don't know how I feel about this, because I do like the security guarantees of having a lot more decentralization within Ethereum, but maybe you say, hey, make the blocks bigger, because that's a parameter change effectively. And yes, you're going to get less decentralization because of the result that it's going to be harder to run a full node, but maybe that's the right trade-off. I haven't actually spent enough time thinking about that, but the builder in me is a little bit more oriented towards that. To be fair, that was my original opinion of what Bitcoin should have done. Is the Bitcoin block should be bigger, and make a bet that the computing platforms, whether it's storage or network bandwidth or processors, or everything just gets faster, and then this is not as much of an issue. But I'm also not working on any of those protocols directly, so that's just my opinion. I think what Ethereum has done really well, and this is the primary reason I'm most interested in it as someone building, right? Like I want to be clear, like my previous answer on Bitcoin, it's actually less on the invest, like do I think like this is money versus this is money, or like what should be your allocation, or like am I a Bitcoin or an Ethereum? No, I just think from a pure like I want to build an application that has some credible amount of decentralization and the core aspects of the architecture, in our case identity. Ethereum is the natural place to go build that, right? Our Farcaster identity registry contract is actually relatively simple in the scheme of Ethereum, like smart contracts. And doing that on Ethereum means I get all of the composability and everything else happening in the ecosystem. You bring up Uniswap, right? Farcaster usernames are going to be NFTs. So out of the box, whether it's Uniswap's NFT platform or OpenSea, all of the economic infrastructure for NFTs, which people think of as like monkey JPEGs or whatever, no, like the domain name auction system, which if you've ever tried to buy a domain name in the DNS world, it's pretty clunky. Versus buying an NFT is like modern e-commerce in the scheme of things. And so all of that comes out of the box, right? And so you can have all these sophisticated, you can have auctions, you can have listed prices, you can, and then they're completely composable. So someone could take an NFT, create ERC20s on it, and then actually have a Uniswap pool, and then based on if you control the majority share of those ERC20s, you can actually now use this Farcaster account. The amount of permissionless innovation that can now happen at that level of our stack is, I think, extraordinary, and it starts to compound on each other, right? It's like for every new thing like Uniswap or OpenSea, in addition to all the tooling like MetaMask and all this other stuff, it just further makes it more appealing for people when they have their next interesting idea to want to go build on top of that. And I use it akin to whether it's Linux or JavaScript or whatever, where once you start to get the ball rolling in one of these kind of composable open source communities, people naturally want to build something that other people will use. And so they're going to go, you're going to write it as an NPM package or a Python package because you know all the machine learning people are going to use it. And so I think that is the thing that Ethereum has done the best. And I think when my biggest critique of other blockchains trying to compete with Ethereum is it's not a checkbox. Oh, well, we have this version of a Uniswap, or we have like it's not a matrix where if you can do all these actions, then people are going to move over to your chain. It's this intangible thing of, I have an interesting new idea. Where is the marginal developer going to go try that idea? They're going to try it where there's the most liquidity, right? It's not about the functionality. It's about the fact that a Bored Ape or a Punk actually, and not even that, you can take something that's even cheaper, though, like an NFT that you'd want to play around with is actually already on Ethereum. And so that is the single best thing that Ethereum has going for it. And even if they screw up a whole bunch of other things, it's a very difficult thing to unwind. And I would just, caveat that with is if someone really comes through with some huge technical innovation, then maybe people will say, hey, it's actually worth rebuilding the ecosystem because this is actually a step function change rather than something that's incremental. And I think people get really hung up on transactions per second, and that's not actually that's more incremental than people think, because anything that's like a lot of transactions per second, if you just add a lot more transactions per second, at some point the bandwidth of that blockchain is going to be full, right? And so I think it's like some fundamentally new architecture or whatever. But in that case, I think a lot of those next generation approaches are actually being built for Ethereum, right? You have your L2s like Optimism and Arbitrum, and then you also have the ZK approaches. That if some of these things that are still very science experimenty right now, they end up working out, then you get kind of the best of both worlds. You get the usability of one of these things that can then compile back down to the security of Ethereum. And maybe someone's able to achieve the same stack on top of Bitcoin, but I think going back to this idea of the developer momentum and each interesting thing that happens on Ethereum encourages the next marginal developer to work on it. I think that's the thing that Bitcoin had for a moment in time. It was very much the case 2014 to late 2016, even when I was at Coinbase. There was still a lot of energy around building on Bitcoin. And then I think 2017, it really shifted over to Ethereum. And you can take the negative side of that coin and say, oh, it was just a bunch of scam ICOs or whatever. But I actually think the thing that lasted, and it clearly worked because what happened, I think, with the DeFi build out over the last few years, is 2017, the energy around Ethereum and the excitement around Ethereum as a developer platform captured enough interest that you then ended up getting a bunch of economic infrastructure that got built out. And again, you can criticize DeFi as being kind of, whether you want to say scammy or not big enough or whatever, but the reality is that Uniswap is actually an amazing application. It works, right? And through all these big crypto blowups, none of the DeFi protocols actually blew up. It was the Terra notwithstanding, because it's slightly different in the sense that the Uniswaps and the Aves and the compounds of the world performed as function, right? Or as designed. And I think that is, I don't know. I think people just want to believe what they want to believe. And so if you don't like crypto, you're just going to find every reason to come up with dumb reasons for crypto. But again, I go back to NFT for us is actually this really interesting thing because we get all this economic infrastructure for free. And I just view an NFT as no different than a file format, right? It's like JPEG or PNG. And it's like, oh, well, what else, other things can you do with a PNG? And I think people get way too religious about like these crypto things versus thinking of them as building blocks. And it's like, I always approach it from, and the thing that's gotten me most interested in crypto over the last 10 years is just like, what can I build with this? Like what new thing can I offer that wasn't possible before? And in the case of Farcaster, we can build a Web 2 like experience on the social network, but under the hood, the identity is truly sovereign. It is not controlled by any individual, any company, any organization or country. And we're not quite there yet, right? Like we're not on Ethereum mainnet. You need to decentralize the governance of the contracts. But when that happens, those Farcaster governance or those Farcaster registry contracts will run forever with the programming that they've been instantiated with. And no one can go and take your username pointer away. And I think that is a really powerful thing because it'll encourage developers to build the next Facebook, the next TikTok, the next Instagram on top of a protocol, because they know that this institution effectively is really solid and is going to outlast any government or different administration or set of rules.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you there, and I think I usually make an analogy in my head with like Ethereum as a blockchain with JavaScript. It was like really early on, and it has such a big ecosystem, and now it has been improving so much over time, and it's catching up, with like newer languages. But the ecosystem is so big, and I think Ethereum is the same. And another point that I thought it was interesting, the Uniswap, right? Like I was looking at their growth, and their growth was, I think in 2.5 years, they grew as much as Coinbase grew in 7 years. And I think Coinbase is one of the fastest growing companies to IPO out of YC. Like I was thinking about it, and looking at their market cap, it was really fast. Even though inside there were ups and downs, and maybe there were times of slowness because of crypto winterness, the growth is really astounding. Okay, I have one last question because we're running out of time. That's related to book recommendations. Do you have a book recommendation that shifted completely your view on something, and you recommend? You're an avid reader, and so any book recommendations there?
Yeah, I think the book, I would say in the last 10 years that shifted my point of view, at least at the time, the most, was definitely Peter Zeihan's Accidental Superpower. And I've talked a lot about Peter Zeihan and, tweeted about it, casted about it. But the basic premise is this is a book that I think came out in 2014. And so it was kind of written around 2012. And Peter Zeihan is a kind of like a strategy consultant for geopolitics. And he kind of has a historical framework that he brings to the table where he basically says all of the great empires first started out by having really good internal transport within their country, usually a navigable river, and good external barriers to prevent invaders from showing up. The quintessential example of this is Egypt. Egypt had, a navigable river for the most part on the Nile and desert on either side, so it kind of keeps invaders out. And so you have this civilization that flourishes for a really long time. And then he kind of shifts to saying the next kind of major advantage for countries is, deep water navigation, and then finally industrialization. And his point is the accidental superpower is the United States because it has the best river system in the world, the Mississippi, Missouri. It has two giant oceans as barriers protecting it. The best Navy in the world, like effectively the only real Navy in the world, and industrialization in the sense that it has all the resources that it ever needs for itself. And so he kind of has that as his framework, and it's a very geography driven. And he goes through basically all the major countries, and he kind of walks through all of their issues. And then he does this in the second book as well. He also kind of predicts in this book a couple of major trends. So the first is deglobalization. So when he's writing it, we're kind of at peak globalization, and everyone is assuming that this is just going to continue forever. Cheap stuff at Walmart, made in China. And he's saying, hey, like the trend is actually going the other way. He says that you're going to probably see some type of populist president in the U.S. that is like anti-free trade, which he kind of gets the idea of Trump right. And then he says the U.S. is actually going to be energy independent with this fracking thing, and he thinks it's going to take longer. And then his follow-up book, he basically is like, I got that wrong. It ended up happening way faster. But and I think all of this stuff is culminated with the war in Ukraine, where and now that zero interest rates are going away, we're kind of like a return to history, so to speak, of like, okay, like the world is a little bit more of a tough place. Like we're not living in this like 30-year post Berlin Wall, end of the Soviet Union, globalization boom. And we're now kind of back to maybe more of a great powers game where you have the US and China and Russia and people kind of figuring things out. And I think the Ukraine war, he both nailed in predicting that Russia would invade Ukraine in one of his books. And then the other thing is that the supply chain impacts of taking a country like Russia out of the global supply chain has had some pretty big reverberations and is actually changing geopolitical moves for a bunch of different countries. And so that book, I think, was important to me because I think I had spent a bunch of time in college and then kind of even in San Francisco. And I think I was a little bit more just consuming a lot of mainstream information. And I think that book was the beginning of me kind of being a little bit more independent thinking in terms of trying to diversify the set of sources that I'm getting, focusing on first principles or primary sources. I mean, being friends with biology and others like that, I think has accelerated that as well. But also even working in crypto, because there's a concept called Gelman amnesia. I always say his name wrong. He's a famous physicist, where he'd say, I'm reading the New York Times and I'm reading the science section and I'm reading something about physics, and I know every single incorrect, inaccuracy written in this article, and I'm like, wow, how did this even get published? This is just kind of crap. And then flip the page, and there's some more happening in some other country, and then you just take the section that you're not an expert in as complete truth, because you just don't have any way of pointing out the holes, when at the same time, this is the same publication that on the page that the information about was not covering stuff correctly. And so having gone through that for 5 years at Coinbase and crypto, I just generally, the way the mainstream media covers crypto is extremely lazy. Like very, very rare to get someone to come in with the nuance or actually do the extra work to maybe get the right quote. They tend to get people who are just like incendiary on the quote side, and the law of bad headlines is just like, okay, like we're going to write the most negative headline that you possibly have. Crypto doesn't help itself, so it's not like it's all roses and rainbows and it's unfairly covered. I think it's more that really had me start to think, and especially actually after I left Coinbase and I took some time off and I did some travel and I spent some time outside the US, and I really got to a place where, okay, I actually don't want to have any one individual or source be the primary way that I think. I want to be able to compile it across a bunch of different points of view. And so it really kicked off when I was off before starting to work on Farcaster, is I tried to read a lot of history books and try to get a lot of diverse points of view. And look, I still read the headlines of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal every single day. I actually don't even need to read the article most of the time, because at this point I've read so many of those articles, I probably know the format of what's going to be said, or you only need to read the first two paragraphs, or like, you get past the intro and then you actually find the point that they're making. But a lot of times they just communicate in the headline, and then you can just read what people are saying on Twitter as the meta commentary. But the point is, I read that, but then I also try to get exposed to as many different ideas on something like Twitter. And so one of the reasons I'm super interested in building something like Farcaster is, I hope it to be global scale, so that as many different viewpoints in the world that exist can actually be on this, just like the internet is. But also, I think that what's cool about building something that's going to have a permissionless set of data and APIs is I actually think developers, as the network and protocol continues to grow, are going to really surprise us in terms of coming up with new ways of presenting information. And like one example of this is, I've always wanted a news site that tries to just basically show you, here is the closest thing to a factual event that we can report, like the highest certainty of like something happened, right? And then give you the opposing views, or you can dial it being like, okay, I want a slightly right of center take on this, or I want a slightly left of center, or I want the extreme views on the same issue, right? And so it's just like, I don't know, but whatever the news is, like the Biden documents, I could care less about the Biden documents, but based on what news source you read, it like is either a nothing burger or it's like the biggest thing, ever. And what I would actually prefer to have is like a bunch of different viewpoints. And obviously I would love them to be intelligent, right? I'd love an intelligent left-leaning take, and I'd love an intelligent right-leaning take. But I think in a world where you really have full access to the data and APIs of a network like Twitter, which is the goal with Farcaster, you will actually have people create things like that. And with machine learning and stuff like that, you could actually get to a place where, you could build apps that deliberately try to get you outside of the filter bubble. Whereas I think with the current instantiation of Twitter, and who knows, Elon may change it, it's actually about time spent. So if you naturally have an inclination to follow right or left-leaning content, you're just like the proverbial like YouTube radicalization. You are actually going to get more and more of the same type of content if you're engaging with that. And so having the freedom to create your own client that maybe doesn't have that self-referential loop, or it's like, hey, it looks like you're actually getting too much of one side, like we're going to actually inject actively the other side. I don't know. The free market can decide if people actually want to live in that kind of world. So long answer on Zihan, but I think it, and by the way, I don't agree with everything that he says. I think he underestimates technology a lot, and he glosses over a lot of details. But I think what's great about Zihan is he presents a lot of data that you can actually go pull from the UN or the EIA on the energy side, and you can verify yourself. And you can say, okay, yeah, that chart is actually true. And so from that regard, I think it's a really interesting book if you've never read it, because it will challenge maybe some preconceived notions on, oh, the U.S. is declining, right? If you read the Ray Dalio book of like losing U.S. reserve currency, and I know we've talked about this a little bit. Like I think Zihan in major points has convinced me that the U.S. is not going to lose its reserve currency anytime soon. And the primary reason is I don't think any other country has like a particularly great outlook. And so far, I think he's kind of right. Like, and so, maybe Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency eventually replaces the global reserve currency. Like that's an area where he was recently on Joe Rogan and he said that wasn't going to happen. But so I disagree with him there. But then the question is, we're just going to argue on timing, because I don't think anyone realistically thinks that the reserve currency of the world is going to be Bitcoin next year. But 10 years is a long time, right? So.
Yeah. Sorry, I wanted to add some points and then close it out. Yeah, in the deglobalization point, I really think that that's happening, but I think it's going to be instead of making cheap stuff in other countries, we're going to make cheap stuff in the countries themselves. So I think a really good example, Teslas are not necessarily cheap, but they're trying to make the cars cheaper and cheaper. And with automation and like more robots and things like that, we can actually make really cheap stuff in the US, in America, in Germany, in China. And I think that's the trend. Another thing that I was thinking about the other day is how, the US and Russia took very similar stances. The US basically blocked Russia, from, I think, getting back their money from treasury. And Russia basically blocked, they had a lot of, they didn't block, but they had a lot of power within Europe, especially Germany, with regards to natural gas. But both situations, they found a way around it, Russia sold it to China or other countries, and Europe found natural gas from, I think, the US. So this deglobalization didn't, even though countries are trying to block each other, the world is so connected and there's so many connections everywhere that's really, really hard for one single country to have such a strong influence, that being either the US or Russia, which maybe that's wrong, but that's what I was thinking the other day. And
maybe you call it reglobalization, right? Like it's just going to reshift the way things are. And yeah, I think that's right. And look, if you believe in free markets, like if there's a high enough price somewhere, someone is going to try to solve that, even if the oceans are a little bit more pirate filled or infested. And some of the things that Zihan says that you kind of roll your eyes and saying, okay, probably not going to happen. That said, I do think it's a useful exercise, and I would give credit to the Biden administration on they've been very aggressive on the trade stuff because they're viewing the kind of Taiwan situation. It's a continuation of some of the stuff that Trump was doing. And I think that the other thing, and it's full of pork, but the fact that the U.S. is now actually investing in onshore chip manufacturing at some level of scale that beyond what we already have, I think is a very positive long-term trend. And then to your point, and I'm a little bit of an Elon stan on this part, but I think that the Tesla robot, which everyone loves to make fun of, whether it's Tesla or somebody else, it's so clear to me that is what's going to happen, where all of a sudden you're going to have a massive deflationary effect because you're going to actually be able to do dangerous and dirty and jobs that basically people don't want to do, right? We have a structural shortage of employment in the U.S. now. I think that is going to be a huge impact on our ability to decide how we want, as a country, where we want to engage in the world and what we want to do. And I'm generally very pro-isolationist. I think we should kind of fix our own problems at home before we're worried about other people. And I think we can offer certain things to other people that want to help us. But I think we have a lot of people in our country that we need to actually focus on first, and a lot of issues that, and infrastructure that we need to improve, rather than mucking around in other people's problems. And that's actually one of the things I think the Zihan book also really made me realize, and this just idea of energy independence is, I think that's actually the root of all evils of everything, is if we can get to some level of super abundant energy in the US with a combination of nuclear, solar, natural gas. And if we can get to that point, I think that just like the world that we can build in our country, but also around the world is going to be really great. And so that's like, if I could redo the technical background that I have, it would be, because I have a pretty limited technical background, it would be much more in the world of atoms than software. But my goal is try to impact the world of software enough that I can then make some impact in the world of atoms later.
Yeah, with that great note, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to me. Really, really appreciate it. I know how busy you are with Farcaster. It's really, really hard to build something really valuable. And I think you and Varun are in the path of doing it. Again, I really, really appreciate, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
All right, perfect.